What happened?
It's Grace. Something happened. I have to go.
I'll drive. You shouldn't drive like this.
A blind date with a single dad turned into the most emotional night of her life. Claire Bennett almost turned around in the parking lot 3 separate times before she finally made it through the restaurant doors, and even then, her hand shook slightly against the cold brass handle. She had no way of knowing, standing there with rain misting against her coat, that in less than 4 hours she would be sitting on a hospital waiting room floor holding a stranger's hand like her life depended on it, or that by the end of the night she would understand grief and hope in a way she never had before. All she knew in that moment was that she was 31 years old, she had not been on a real date in almost 2 years, and she was terrified. The message from her coworker Denise had arrived 11 days earlier, tucked between 2 unrelated work emails like it wasn't about to upend Claire's carefully guarded routine. I know a guy. Single dad, really good one, not the disaster kind. His name's Daniel. Just one dinner, Claire. You don't have to marry him. Claire had stared at that message for a long time before responding. She'd built her life since the divorce into something small and manageable, a 2-bedroom apartment in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago, a stable job doing marketing for a nonprofit, a strict rotation of grocery runs and laundry days and the particular quiet of an evening with no one to answer to but herself. It wasn't a bad life. It was just a life designed, very deliberately, to never again require the kind of vulnerability that had nearly broken her the last time she'd let someone in. Her marriage to Marcus had ended 2 years ago, not with the dramatic betrayal people expected when they heard the word divorce, but with something quieter and somehow more devastating, 3 years of trying for a baby that never came, followed by the slow, grinding realization that grief over a child who never existed could hollow out a marriage just as thoroughly as any affair. Marcus had wanted to stop trying long before Claire was ready to. Their divorce had been amicable in the way that things are amicable when both people are simply too exhausted to fight anymore. She remembered, standing in front of her closet an hour before the date, pulling out 3 different dresses and putting all 3 back before finally settling on the simplest one she owned, dark green with a modest neckline, nothing that suggested she was trying too hard or not hard enough. She had stood in front of the mirror longer than she cared to admit, studying a woman she barely recognized anymore, not because anything about her appearance had changed dramatically, but because the last time she'd dressed for a date, she had still believed she was building toward something. A husband. A family. A life that looked like the ones her college friends kept posting about, all matching pajamas and gender reveal parties and nurseries painted in soft yellows because nobody wanted to guess wrong. That life had quietly dissolved somewhere between the second failed round of fertility treatments and the 16th month of trying, until all that remained was 2 exhausted people sitting across from each other at dinner with nothing left to say that wouldn't reopen the same wound. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone the week before, gently prodding, the way mothers do. You deserve to try again, sweetheart. Not for a baby. Just for yourself. Claire hadn't fully believed her at the time, had made the kind of non-committal agreeing sound daughters make when they want to end a conversation without conflict. But some part of the sentence had lodged itself in her chest anyway, because she suspected, underneath all her careful resistance, that her mother might be right. So when Claire finally texted back okay, one dinner, no promises, she told herself it was just to make Denise stop asking. She told herself the same thing all the way through choosing an outfit, through the drive to the restaurant, through the 3 separate near departures in the parking lot. She was still telling herself that when she walked through the door of Rosalind's, a small Italian place with candlelight in the windows and the low hum of a Tuesday evening crowd, and spotted a man sitting at a corner table with a phone in one hand and a look of quiet, contained anxiety on his face that mirrored her own. He stood the moment he saw her, and something about the way he did it, not smoothly, not performed, just a little too fast, a little too eager, made Claire's guard drop half an inch before she'd even said hello. Claire, he asked. I'm Daniel. Sorry, I'm sure that was obvious, you probably saw my picture 40 times before tonight the way I definitely looked at yours. Claire laughed despite herself. I looked at it twice. Maybe 3 times. I'm going to pretend that's not a slight against my photogenic qualities and just be grateful you're here at all. He gestured to the chair across from him. I almost cancelled this morning. Full disclosure. Got about as far as typing out the message before I deleted it. I almost didn't get out of my car 10 minutes ago, Claire admitted, sliding into the seat. So I think we're even. Daniel was, Claire noted as she settled in, exactly the kind of handsome that snuck up on you rather than announcing itself, dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, a well-worn navy sweater that looked soft rather than stylish, and the particular exhausted kindness in his eyes that Claire had started to recognize in people who had survived something significant and come out the other side gentler for it rather than harder. Denise didn't tell me much about you, Claire said, once the waiter had come and gone with their drink orders. Just that you were, and I quote, not the disaster kind of single dad. Daniel laughed, a real laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. High praise from Denise. She's seen the disaster kind up close. Her sister dated one for 2 years. What makes you the non-disaster kind, then? I show up for pickup on time. I remember which day is picture day at school. I haven't forgotten a single one of my daughter's allergies in 4 years of packing her lunch. He said it lightly, but Claire caught the small current of pride underneath it, the pride of a man who had built an entire life around getting the small things right because the big thing, the thing that mattered most, had already gone catastrophically wrong once. Tell me about her, Claire said. Your daughter. Something in Daniel's whole posture softened at the question, the way a person's face changes when you ask about the thing they love most in the world. Grace. She's 4. She's obsessed with dinosaurs in a very specific and very serious way. She'll correct you if you call a pterodactyl a dinosaur, because apparently that's a significant taxonomic error. He smiled. She's staying with my sister tonight. First night away from me in almost 8 months, actually. I think I've texted her twice already to make sure everything's fine. 8 months is a long time to not have a night to yourself. It's been a lot of things, the last 8 months. Daniel turned his water glass slowly, choosing his next words with visible care. My wife, Grace's mom, she passed away almost 3 years ago. Cancer. It moved fast, faster than anyone expected, and Grace was barely 1 when it happened. She doesn't remember her mother at all, which is either a mercy or the saddest thing I've ever had to accept, and some days I genuinely don't know which. I'm so sorry, Claire said, and meant it in the particular way you mean things when you recognize the shape of a wound because you carry one of your own, even if yours had a different origin. Thank you. It gets carried differently over time. Not lighter exactly. Just different. He looked up and met her eyes. What about you? Denise was vague about your history, in that deliberately unhelpful way she has. Claire considered how much to say, weighing the version of her story that was easy against the version that was true. She chose true. I got divorced 2 years ago. We tried for a baby for 3 years before that. It never happened, and somewhere in the middle of all that trying, we lost each other instead. It wasn't anyone's fault, exactly. It was just too much grief for 2 people to carry without it eventually crushing the thing between them. That's its own kind of loss, Daniel said quietly. Losing a future you'd already built in your head, before you even got the chance to live it. I don't think people talk about that kind of grief enough. It doesn't come with the same permission to mourn as losing something you actually had. Claire felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. That's exactly it. Everyone kept telling me it was probably for the best, like the years of hoping didn't count for anything just because there was no baby at the end of them to prove it mattered. It mattered, Daniel said, simple and certain. All of it mattered. They sat with that for a moment, the candle between them flickering slightly in a draft from the door, and Claire felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could comfortably admit, the particular relief of being understood by someone who wasn't performing sympathy but actually recognized the shape of the thing you were describing because they had lived something adjacent to it themselves. The food arrived, and the conversation loosened further, drifting into easier territory: favorite childhood books, the worst jobs they'd each survived in their 20s, a long and increasingly ridiculous debate about whether a hot dog qualified as a sandwich, which Daniel argued with the passionate conviction of a man who had clearly had this argument many times before and lost none of his enthusiasm for it. Claire found herself laughing more in that first hour than she had in months, the careful walls she'd built over 2 years quietly lowering themselves without her fully noticing until they were already halfway down. "Worst job," Daniel said, pointing his fork at her. "Go. I need to know what you survived before you became a respectable non-profit marketing professional." "I sold vacuum cleaners door to door for exactly 1 summer when I was 22, Claire admitted. "I was catastrophically bad at it. I once spent 40 minutes convincing a very kind elderly man that he needed a $900 vacuum, and at the end of it he handed me a glass of lemonade and told me, very gently, that he already owned 3 vacuums and simply felt bad watching me struggle. That's the most Midwestern rejection I've ever heard in my life. He was very nice about it. I cried in my car afterward anyway. My worst job was substitute teaching a middle school gym class for exactly 1 week before I decided teaching wasn't for me and went into accounting instead," Daniel said. 13-year-olds have no mercy. None. I once got hit directly in the face with a dodgeball while trying to explain the rules of dodgeball, which in retrospect might have actually been the rules working correctly. That's either irony or poetic justice. I've never fully decided which." He took a sip of his wine, still smiling. "I respect anyone who's been humbled by a vacuum cleaner and an elderly man's lemonade, though. That takes a special kind of resilience. It built character. Character I promptly forgot about the moment I got a real job with health insurance." They moved from there into books. Daniel confessed to reading the same 3 fantasy novels on a loop since college because new books felt like a commitment he rarely had energy for anymore, while Claire admitted she hadn't finished a novel in over a year, her attention span worn down by exhaustion and the particular scattered focus of living alone with too much quiet. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Daniel reached across the table, not to touch her hand but simply to steal a piece of bread from her plate with the unthinking familiarity of someone who had already stopped performing politeness and started being genuinely comfortable, and Claire found she didn't mind at all. "Denise told me you volunteer somewhere," Daniel said. "Something with kids, I think she mentioned." "I read to kids at the children's hospital once a month. Started about a year ago." Claire turned her wine glass slowly. "I think I needed somewhere to put all the love I'd built up during those years of trying for a baby. It had nowhere else to go, so I found somewhere to give it instead." "That's beautiful," Daniel said quietly. "And devastating. Both at once. Most good things are, I've noticed." "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, somewhere in the second hour, his tone shifting slightly, more careful. "And you can tell me it's too much for a first date." "Go ahead." "Are you scared of this? Dating someone with a kid, I mean. Not hypothetically. Actually." Claire considered the question honestly instead of reaching for something safe. "Yes. Genuinely, yes. Not because I don't like kids, I love kids, desperately, in a way that used to feel like torture during the years we were trying and failing to have one of our own. I'm scared because loving a child who isn't biologically mine, and then somehow losing that connection if things between us don't work out, sounds like exactly the kind of grief I don't know if I can survive a second time." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing this without flinching from it. "That's the most honest answer anyone's given me in longer than I can remember. Most people either pretend the fear doesn't exist or use it as an excuse to bail before things get complicated. I appreciate that you did neither. What about you? Are you scared?" "Every single day," Daniel said. "I buried the person I promised to build my whole life around. Some mornings the fear of that happening again is loud enough to drown out almost everything else I feel. But I made a decision a while back that living small and safe forever wasn't actually protecting Grace from anything. It was just teaching her that love isn't worth the risk. I don't want that to be the lesson she learns from watching me. Claire's eyes stung unexpectedly, and she reached for her water glass to give herself something to do with her hands. That's a brave thing to decide. Or a reckless one. I go back and forth. I think it's both, Claire said. I think most brave things are. It was somewhere around this point, the conversation stretching easily into its third hour, plates cleared and coffee arriving unbidden, that Daniel's phone lit up on the table between them, buzzing insistently. He glanced at it, and Claire watched his entire expression change in the space of half a second, the easy warmth draining out of his face, replaced by something tight and alarmed. I'm sorry, I need to take this, he said, already standing, phone pressed to his ear before he'd finished the sentence. Claire watched him walk toward the restaurant entrance, his shoulders rigid, one hand braced against the wall as he listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. He came back less than 2 minutes later, and Claire knew before he said a word that something had gone seriously wrong. His face had gone pale, his hands visibly unsteady as he gathered his jacket from the back of his chair. It's Grace, he said, voice tight and controlled in the specific way people control their voices when they're trying not to fall apart in public. My sister says she's having some kind of allergic reaction. They're on the way to the hospital now. I have to go. Go, Claire said immediately, already reaching for her own coat. Let me drive you. You shouldn't be behind the wheel like this. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm doing it anyway. Come on. There wasn't time for further argument, and something in Claire's tone must have carried enough certainty that Daniel didn't try to fight her on it. They left cash on the table for a meal neither of them had finished and moved through the restaurant fast enough that heads turned, out into the cold rain-slicked evening where Claire's car sat 2 rows back in the lot. The drive to Lurie Children's Hospital took 11 minutes, though it felt considerably longer, filled with a silence broken only by Daniel's knee bouncing anxiously and the occasional strangled sound of him trying to steady his breathing. Claire kept her eyes on the road and her voice low and even, the way she imagined a person might talk to someone standing too close to a ledge. Tell me about her allergies, Claire said. What are we dealing with? Tree nuts. Severe. She's never had a reaction this bad before, usually it's hives, some swelling, nothing that's needed an ER before. My sister said she found Grace eating something at a birthday party, some kind of pastry, and within minutes her lips were swelling and she was having trouble breathing. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. She used the EpiPen. They're already in the ambulance. That was the right call. That's exactly what she was supposed to do. I should have been there, Daniel said, and Claire heard the particular anguish of a parent who believed, against all logic, that his physical presence could have prevented a stranger's negligence at a birthday party 3 miles away. I should have gone with her instead of. Daniel. Claire's voice was firm without being harsh. You are allowed 1 night away from your daughter in 8 months without that meaning you failed her. This isn't your fault. Nothing about tonight is your fault. He didn't answer, but she saw his hands unclench slightly in his lap, and she counted that as a small victory in a night that had suddenly filled itself with much larger, much more frightening things. They arrived at the hospital to find Daniel's sister, a woman named Patricia with the same dark hair and the same tightly controlled panic in her eyes, pacing the emergency room waiting area with her phone clutched in one hand. She embraced Daniel the second he came through the doors, both of them talking over each other in the fast, fractured way people talk when fear has stripped away all their usual patience for complete sentences. They took her back already, Patricia said. The epinephrine worked, they said, but they want to monitor her for a few hours because of how severe it was. She's stable, Daniel. She's stable, but she was so scared, and she kept asking for you. Something in Daniel's face crumpled at that, the particular anguish of a parent hearing that their child had needed them and they hadn't been there. A nurse came through a set of double doors moments later and, after a brief exchange of information, led Daniel back to see his daughter, leaving Claire standing in the waiting room with Patricia, both of them strangers bound together suddenly by the same terrifying evening. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, once Daniel had disappeared through the doors. "You were on your date with him, weren't you? Denise mentioned tonight was the night. I'm so sorry it turned into this." "Please don't apologize," Claire said. "I'm glad I was there to drive him. I'm glad Grace is okay." Patricia studied her for a moment, something assessing in her expression that reminded Claire uncomfortably of every first meeting with a protective family member she'd ever endured. "You didn't have to come with him. Most people wouldn't have, on a first date. Most people would have called it a night and gone home." "I'm not most people," Claire said simply, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it with a conviction she hadn't expected to feel this early into an evening that had gone so thoroughly sideways. She waited in that hospital lobby for nearly 2 hours, sitting in a hard plastic chair beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly gray, scrolling through nothing on her phone because she couldn't focus long enough to actually read anything, watching the clock on the wall tick forward with agonizing slowness. She thought about leaving twice. This was, after all, a level of involvement that no reasonable person would expect from a first date gone wrong. But every time the thought surfaced, she found herself dismissing it just as quickly, because leaving felt, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, like abandoning something she had already decided mattered to her. At one point, Patricia sat down beside her with 2 vending machine coffees, handing one over without asking whether Claire wanted it. "You don't have to keep me company," Patricia said. "I know how to sit in a waiting room by myself. I've had practice." "I don't mind," Claire said, and found it was true. There was something steadying about sitting beside another person who understood exactly how slowly time moved in a place like this. "Has this happened before? The allergic reactions?" "Twice, before tonight. Never this severe." Patricia wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she needed the warmth of it more than the caffeine. "Daniel keeps EpiPens in every bag he owns. His car, his work bag, the diaper bag he still hasn't thrown out even though Grace hasn't worn a diaper in 2 years. He's careful in a way that would seem excessive if you didn't know why." "He seems like he'd be careful about everything," Claire said. "The kind of person who double-checks the stove is off 3 times before leaving the house." Patricia laughed, quiet and tired. "You have no idea. He called me at 2 in the morning once, in Grace's first year, convinced she'd stopped breathing in her sleep. She was fine. He sat in her nursery until sunrise anyway, just watching her chest rise and fall." She glanced sideways at Claire. "He wasn't always like this, you know. Before Elena died. He was more relaxed. Grief made him vigilant in a way that's kept Grace safer, probably, but it's also kept him exhausted for 3 straight years. That sounds like a lonely way to live." "It is," Patricia said simply. "Which is why I was glad when Denise mentioned you. Not because I think one dinner fixes 3 years of exhaustion. But because he agreed to try it all. That's not nothing, coming from him." Claire turned her coffee cup slowly, watching the steam curl upward into the fluorescent light. "I understand loneliness like that. Different shape, same weight." "I could tell," Patricia said, not unkindly. "The way you didn't hesitate tonight. Most people hesitate. You didn't." They sat together for a while after that without speaking much, 2 women bound together by the same anxious vigil, the hospital around them humming with its usual quiet chaos, pages over the intercom, the distant sound of a child crying somewhere down the hall, the soft rubber squeak of nurses' shoes against linoleum. Claire found herself thinking, in the strange suspended way you think during moments like this, about how quickly a life could reorganize itself around people you'd known for only a few hours, if you let it. When Daniel finally emerged through the double doors, his face was pale and hollowed out with exhaustion, but there was relief there too, real and visible. "She's okay," he said, before Claire had even asked. "She's stable, the swelling's gone down. They want to keep her a few more hours for observation but she's going to be fine. She's asking for ice cream now, which the nurse says is a very good sign. That's the best sign there is, Claire said, standing. You're still here. Daniel said it like he genuinely hadn't expected it, like some part of him had assumed she would have slipped away hours ago, and Claire felt a small ache at the assumption, understanding immediately how many times in his life someone probably had. Of course I'm still here. You didn't have to stay. This is not exactly the first date you signed up for. No, Claire agreed. It's not. It's better, actually. Not the circumstances, those were terrifying, and I'm so sorry Grace had to go through that. But I got to see something tonight I don't think I would have seen over a normal dinner. I got to see who you actually are when everything falls apart. That matters more to me than a nice meal ever could. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression Claire couldn't quite name, something between disbelief and a dawning, fragile kind of hope. Can I ask you something? And I promise this is the last big question of the night, because I think we've both had enough big things for one evening. Go ahead. Would you want to meet her? Not tonight, she needs rest, and honestly so do I. But sometime soon. I know that's fast. I know most people would say it's too fast, meeting the kid after one date that half imploded before dessert even arrived. I'd like that, Claire said, and felt the truth of it settle warmly in her chest despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. I'd like that a lot. They stood together in that hospital lobby a while longer, not saying much, simply existing in the particular quiet that follows a crisis once the worst of the fear has drained away and left only tiredness in its place. Eventually a nurse came to tell Daniel he could go back and sit with Grace properly, and Claire offered to wait or to go, whichever he needed, and he asked her, quietly, if she would stay just a little longer, and she did. It was nearly midnight by the time Claire finally drove home, the city lights smeared gold and white against her rain-streaked windshield, her body exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the particular weight of having cared, deeply and immediately, about people she had known for only a handful of hours. She thought about Grace, a 4-year-old she had never met, fighting for breath in an ambulance while a birthday party continued obliviously behind her. She thought about Daniel's hands shaking on the steering wheel he hadn't been allowed to touch, about Patricia's fierce, protective worry, about the particular bravery it took for a man who had already lost one person he loved to let himself hope for something new, even in the middle of watching his daughter suffer. Mostly, though, she thought about the version of herself that had almost turned around in the parking lot 3 times before walking into that restaurant, and how far that version of herself already felt from the woman driving home now, someone who had spent 2 years building a life deliberately small enough that nothing could hurt her again, only to discover in a single unexpected evening that the smallness had never actually been safety. It had only ever been a slower, quieter kind of loss. Grace was discharged the following afternoon, and 3 days after that, Claire met her properly for the first time, in Daniel's small backyard on a Saturday warm enough for the last of the season's sunlight to feel generous rather than fading. Grace approached the introduction with the serious gravity of a 4-year-old conducting an important interview, asking Claire no fewer than 11 separate questions about dinosaurs before apparently deciding she had passed some invisible test, at which point she took Claire's hand without ceremony and led her toward a small plastic dinosaur collection arranged with great care across the porch steps. This is a triceratops, Grace informed her solemnly, holding up a small green figure. He's the strongest one. He has 3 horns. That does sound very strong, Claire agreed. Daddy says you drove him to the hospital when I got sick. Grace looked up at her with the direct, unguarded curiosity only small children seem capable of. Are you going to be my friend now? Claire glanced toward the porch, where Daniel stood watching this exchange with an expression so openly hopeful it made her chest ache, and then looked back down at Grace, at this small, fierce, dinosaur-obsessed girl who had already, in the space of one terrifying night and one ordinary Saturday afternoon, begun to matter to her in ways she hadn't expected to allow so soon. I think I'd like that very much, Claire said. Grace nodded, satisfied, as though this had never really been in doubt, and pressed the small plastic triceratops into Claire's palm with the solemn generosity children reserve only for the people they've decided, on their own uncomplicated terms, to trust completely. Months later, long after that first terrifying night had settled into something they could look back on with something closer to gratitude than fear, Claire would think often about how strange it was that the worst moment of that evening had somehow also become the moment everything actually began. Not the easy conversation over dinner, not the careful, hopeful flirtation before Daniel's phone had lit up with the call that changed everything, but the 11 minutes of silent driving through rain-soaked streets, the 2 hours in a hospital waiting room built on nothing but the decision to stay when leaving would have been so much easier. She had spent 2 years believing that safety meant keeping her heart small enough that nothing could reach it. What she learned instead, in the space of one impossible night, was that the people worth loving were rarely found in the safe, uncomplicated moments. They were found in the moments that asked everything of you, all at once, without warning, and in whether you stayed anyway. There would be harder nights ahead, she knew, because there always were when two broken families tried to become one whole one. There would be nights when Grace missed a mother she couldn't remember and didn't know how to name what she was grieving. There would be nights when Daniel's old fear resurfaced without warning, when he would go quiet and distant for an evening, haunted by the particular terror of a man who had already learned exactly how much loss a life could hold. There would be nights when Claire herself would wake at 3 a.m, gripped by the old ache of the family she'd once imagined and never gotten to have, grieving a version of her life that had never existed outside her own hopeful mind. Love, she was learning, didn't erase any of that. It simply gave you people to carry it alongside. But there would also be mornings like the one that came almost a year later, when Claire stood in Daniel's kitchen, their kitchen, she was slowly learning to call it, watching Grace attempt to explain, with great 5-year-old authority, the correct pronunciation of Tyrannosaurus Rex to anyone who would listen, while Daniel burned the eggs slightly and blamed it, unconvincingly, on the pan. There would be the particular joy of watching Grace fall asleep against her shoulder during a long car ride home from the zoo, trusting and unguarded in a way that still occasionally stole Claire's breath with its enormity. There would be quiet evenings on the porch, Daniel's hand in hers, both of them watching the sky change color over a life neither of them had planned but had chosen anyway, deliberately, with open eyes, fully aware of everything it might cost. Claire stayed. And in staying, she found not just a man who had already survived one devastating loss and chosen, against every fearful instinct, to open himself to hope again, but a fierce, dinosaur-loving little girl who had decided, in her own uncomplicated way, that Claire belonged in her small and precious world. Together, the three of them built something slowly, imperfectly, out of the wreckage of what each of them had already lost, not a replacement for anything, never that, but something new entirely, built with the particular courage of people who understood exactly how much love could cost, and chose to risk it anyway. Sometimes Claire thought back to Denise's message, the one that had started all of it, sitting so casually between two unrelated work emails as though it weren't about to rearrange the entire architecture of her life. She thought about how close she'd come to deleting it without responding, how easily this whole story could have simply never begun. And she thought, too, about that hospital waiting room, the hard plastic chair, the fluorescent lights, the particular fear of watching a man she barely knew fall apart over a child she hadn't yet met, and how instead of running from all of it, she had leaned in, had stayed, had let herself become someone who mattered in a story that had nothing to do with her own carefully constructed safety. Grace still kept that small green triceratops on her nightstand, long after the rest of her dinosaur collection had been rotated in and out of favor a dozen times over. She told Claire once, with the offhand honesty only children seem capable of, that it was her favorite because it reminded her of the night Claire became her friend. Claire had needed a moment before she could answer, her throat too tight around all the things a 5-year-old couldn't possibly understand yet about grief and fear and the long, uncertain road that had led the three of them here. Some nights begin as ordinary dinners and end as the most frightening hours of your life. And some of those same nights, if you're brave enough to stay through every terrifying minute of them, quietly become the beginning of everything that matters most.